Hello class, welcome to the screencast for the section in your book, Knowing God Through Natural Revelation. It is section 2 in chapter 1 of your textbook. For those of you that still have the old edition, that's on pages 7 through 8, but for the new edition, it's on pages 9 through 11. And in order to do this, we need to look at the actual definition of the term natural revelation. Natural revelation is defined in the new edition on page 10 as the knowledge of the existence of God and his basic attributes that can be derived by human reason while reflecting on the creative order. In other words, can we just look at the world around us and come to a conclusion that there is a God using our human reason? Your book then goes on to tell a little story about a guy named Johannes Kepler. He was an astronomer in the 15 and 1600s. His dates are up there. He is a very important person in the study of physics and science because he is the person that determined that planets orbit around the sun not in circles but in elliptical orbits. So he is a pretty serious legend in the scientific community, but also a very, very devout believer in God. On pages 9 through 10 in the new edition, there's a story about him and his skeptical friend, and you can read through it, his model of the universe, whereby the person who doesn't really believe that there is a God, a friend of Kepler's, comes in and sees that he's made this little model of the universe, and the friend says, "That's beautiful, who made it?" And Kepler, trying to be a little tongue-in-cheek about it, he says, "Oh, nobody made it. It made itself." And the friend, of course, presses him and says, "Come on, who made this?" And Kepler is able to say back to him, "Well, you say this universe created itself, and this is only a cheap model of the universe. So it made itself, did it not?" And if he disagreed with that, then Kepler had his argument, because if that universe didn't make itself, then neither did this cheap model of the universe. And the universe itself is a lot more complex than Kepler's model. So the idea something does not come out of nothing is what we get from this story. So there's Kepler's use of reason to find God's existence. But one of the things that it later does is that the chapter then introduces us to a real giant in the field of theology, our boy Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 1200s, which is the late medieval period. And he was a giant in more ways than one. He was a very large man, but he also was a giant mind. His use of reason and logic and philosophy and theology is almost unparalleled in all of human history. Many people look at Thomas Aquinas as the mind of the Middle Ages. His concept of theology was not something that we just believe and that's it. It was very much in line with another theologian, St. Anselm's expression, and that is this right here. Theology is faith seeking understanding. Not merely faith because somebody said so, but believing in something and then using your reason to understand that something. And your book, on page 11 in the new edition, then goes into what we call Thomas's 5 arguments, or 5 proofs. Sometimes people call it the 5 proofs, for the existence of God. Thomas, being a doctor of the church, which is defined on page 10, is very, very elaborate in how he does these 5 arguments for the existence of God. Here is a chart of those 5 arguments. Now, Thomas is a really great writer. Here's how he does it. He starts up at the top here, and he asks the question, does God exist? And he begins his argument with the arguments against his argument. The man is called St. Thomas Aquinas, so you know he believes in God, right? But how he starts off saying, it seems God doesn't exist. And here's objection number 1. He says, God doesn't exist because if God did exist, there would be no evil. because God is infinite goodness. And if there is infinite goodness, how can there be any evil? But there is evil. Therefore, God does not exist. And then he does objection number 2 right here. He says, God doesn't exist because you can explain everything in the world either by nature or human reason. You have human reason, and there's nature right in front of you. The trees, the sky, the planets, the clouds, everything. That can explain all that you need to know, so there's no need for God to exist. What you know about those 2 objections, those are pretty good objections. They're pretty good reasons to not believe in God. So Thomas isn't giving fluffy little reasons or easily destroyable reasons. We call them straw man reasons. If you think of a straw man, a scarecrow, a straw man is something you can easily knock over. These are not straw man arguments. These are good, solid, rational arguments saying that God doesn't exist. And that's how Thomas starts off. But you and I know that he believes God exists. He says, on the contrary, I say, God says, I am that I am. God's existence can be proven in 5 ways. And here, right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the 5 arguments. So let's look at your book, have your book open, and then we'll go through each of the 5 arguments. First argument is the argument of motion. And I got dominoes over here. It goes like this. In the universe, things are moving. And you guys in science class learned Newton's laws of motion. An object is at rest will stay at rest unless it is acted upon by an unbalanced force. That means there's a mover. An unbalanced force is a mover, something that moves something in the universe. One domino moves another domino, etc., etc., etc. Now, this chain of movers, Thomas says it's illogical to say that this chain just keeps going on to infinity, so we have to have a mover that doesn't get moved, an unmoved first mover. We call that unmoved first mover God. The second argument is the argument of cause and effect. In the universe, there are causes and effects. The effects are the result of the causes, and it's a continuous chain, just like the argument of motion. And Thomas says that chain can't go on forever, cause and effect, cause and effect. There has to be an ultimate cause, something that is all cause and no effect. That uncaused first cause is that thing which we call God. Argument number 3. In your book, they call number 3, everything comes from something, and God is the something. That's not the language that Thomas uses. I'm going to use the language that Thomas uses up here. Necessary versus dependent. And I put a family tree over here. In order for you to exist, let's say this is you down here, all right, you're one of the kids, you are dependent upon your 2 parents coming together and making you, and you are dependent upon them, and they were each dependent on their own parents, and their own parents were each dependent on their own set of parents, and back and back and back. It's another chain argument. So things in the universe depend on other things to exist. Those other things are necessary. It is necessary that my mom and dad married each other in order for me to be alive. This chain cannot go on forever. It cannot be infinite. Therefore, there must be an ultimate necessary being, and that ultimate necessary being is whom we call God. The fourth argument is the argument of the supreme model or of perfection. Your book says God is the supreme model. If you think about the iPhone, and this picture is already out of date because the iPhone 7 was just released, right? So here we have the iPhone 3G, the iPhone 4, the iPhone 5, 5C, 6, 6 Plus, Apple, and all the other mobile phone companies are doing more and more improvements to make it more perfect, more perfect, more perfect. And they're building up towards perfection. There are degrees of perfection. We even see this in nature. If you look outside, you see a tree, and you're like, oh, that's a nice tree. But then you see another tree, and its branches are more full, and the leaves are better. And you're like, that tree is a little more perfect than the other one. Well, we have these degrees in nature. We compare them all the time, and it's like it's building up to something. It's building up to perfection. We must then believe that perfection actually exists, and that all-perfect being is what we call God. And finally, God is the grand designer, it says in your book. I have up here the ordered universe. The universe has an order to it, from atoms and molecules to planets and galaxies, to the way the sun rises and the sun sets, to the way the wind blows, to the way the water cycle, if the water evaporates, goes up into clouds, come down as rain, nourishes the plants and animals, and goes back. So it's all got a plan. It's all ordered. Everything does what it's supposed to do. If there is an order or a design, then that precludes that there has to be a designer behind that design. Therefore, God is the all-intelligent grand designer.